Thank you very much, Commodore Turner. I'll now ask our next speaker, Air Vice Marshal Robert Chipman, AM, CSC, who is the head of the Military Strategic Commitments Division and is responsible for the strategic level management and situational awareness of current and potential Australian Defence Force commitments. Air Vice Marshal Chipman joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1989, graduating from Sydney University with an honours degree in aeronautical engineering in 1992. He completed a pilot's course, the F-18 operational conversion, and later on the fighter combat instructor course. Following various operational instructor assignments, he commanded number 75 Squadron and number 81 Wing. His operational service includes Operation Slipper as a battle cab director in the United States Air Force 609th Air and Space Operations Centre and Operation Okra as Commander Air Task Unit 630.1. Air Vice Marshal Chipman has a Master's in Business Administration, is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program. Would you please welcome Air Vice Marshal Chipman?
Terrific. Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address the Defence Reserve Association National Conference. Can I start by thanking you also for your flexibility with timings this morning? It might be a Saturday, but we're having a wonderful MSC day here in Canberra, trying to do some work, and I understand the Minister might have given you some insights into the sorts of things that are keeping us busy this morning. Can I also start by congratulating you, Paul, on putting together a fantastic agenda for today. You had it all set out logically, and it would have made a lot of sense for me to follow the Minister and Shadow Minister this morning. What I hope to do is still offer an overview. I know you will have delved deeper already into some of these topics, but it should still give you a sense for how we operate in defence, and then those topics will start hopefully to make a little bit more sense, or you may have a little bit more context for them as the briefings go on for the rest of the day. I'd also like to start by sharing with you all a personal experience that I have working with reserve personnel. My life as a junior officer, I was part of a small workforce, a relatively small workforce with relatively specialist skills, and it required a very large upfront training investment that had two implications. Firstly, it took us a long time to progress individuals through the training program, and it also had a very large investment of instructors, a large instructor workforce relative to the training continuum and the numbers of people we had out in the operational community. And we also were developing people with skill sets that were attractive outside of defence, and so there was a demand from outside in jobs that were quite well remunerated as well. So all of that meant that our pyramid, our workforce pyramid, was hopelessly out of shape, and that our workforce model was fundamentally unsustainable. Now, we were fortunate so this is almost 30 years ago now, that a relatively high proportion of our instructor workforce was filled out by reserve officers. They created long-term ballast in our organisations. They provided exceptional experience as instructors and as officers within the Air Force, and they brought a lot of skill to our training establishments to help nurse our workforce back to health. They were complemented at the time by some very flexible lateral recruitment programs, which the Brits and the US and the Canadians don't thank us for even today. But we were able to get like-minded nations to come in and work not just in our schools, but in our operational squadrons. And that provided an early and quite an emphatic demonstration of the sorts of flexibility that we seek in our workforce today. And I can tell you certainly from the perspective of a student, but also later as the executive officer of that unit responsible for managing instructors across our training tasks, it made absolutely no difference to me whether an instructor was a permanent officer or a reserve officer when it came to achieving particular tasks. And that has been my experience. That's the foundational experience I have working with reserve personnel, and it remains, a guiding principle for me in my work today. Now, it might be useful if I start by providing some insight into my responsibilities as head of military strategic commitments, and then hopefully that will flow into a useful discussion about how we see the reserve workforce. MSC is responsible for developing advice for the CDF on the ways and means that the ADF might be employed to achieve government policy end states. Our work is frequently dominated by crisis response, where we work as the lead agency within Defence, coordinating across government agencies to develop national whole of government responses to whatever the crisis might be. It's strategic J3 work, but it's not exclusively. And so let me share with you some of the other issues that are currently absorbing our time at MSC. The first is, as you are well aware, our military strategy today is now dominated by great power competition in the Indo-Pacific region. And we are reconfiguring our entire operational commitments to make sure that we're better configured for that fight. From a military commitments perspective, this is seeing a drawdown of our forces in the Middle East. We will leave a residual footprint in the Middle East, and that will enable us to stay well connected into the counter-terrorism infrastructure that's been built up in the Middle East over 20 years. It'll keep a light on for the defence cooperation programs that we have with the various nations that we've been working closely with there. It'll help support our contributions to multilateral forum like the United Nations and our peacekeeping operations throughout the Levant and North Africa. And it'll also support global mobility as a lily pad, halfway across the globe, should we need to manoeuvre back into the Middle East sometime in the future. Now, as you're no doubt aware from conversations this morning, there are still some legacy issues with us moving out of the Middle East and drawing down from the Middle East, and in particular the challenges of resettling Afghan nationals and their families who supported Australia's mission is of key concern to the government at the moment. Despite what you may have read, there is a significant effort underway across Defence and DFAT, Home Affairs, to make sure that we are dealing with this in an honourable and fair way. But there are immense challenges to this process, balancing that moral obligation with the requirement to make sure we're vetting that workforce and processing applications so that they're not taking advantage of Australia's goodwill, essentially coming out here. We're also trying, as part of this reconfiguration to the Indo-Pacific region, to bring a little bit more coherence to our regional activities. These include soft power outreach initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, or such as the Indo-Pacific Endeavour, which is focused in Southeast Asia. We also have enhanced regional engagement, which brings together all of our operations in the Southwest Pacific. And then they effectively pull together the military contributions to Australia's Pacific Step Up program, which is in many respects offering a vital counterweight to other coercive forces in our region. Our presence takes on a sharper dimension through regional presence deployments, which is our maritime and air deployments up into Southeast Asia and through the South China Sea and right up into North Asia. And what they seek to do effectively is normalise ADF presence and challenge any unilateral claims to sovereignty in that part of the world. It also involves strengthening our alliance networks. It's more frequent and more sophisticated cooperation with the US. It's broadening our alliance networks to include other partners and particularly the Five Eyes nations, the Quad, increased bilateral cooperation, for example, with the UK Carrier Strike Group, French naval deployments, and even a German frigate that'll be visiting our region in the near future. But really, that's the backdrop to the current exigencies that we deal with and the crises that pop up. And it will come as no surprise to you that COVID-19 pandemic has taken the lion's share of our attention through 2021. Now, the way in which we respond to crisis is through the Australia's crisis management framework, which I've been asked to specifically talk to you about in my presentation today. The Australian Government Crisis Management Framework outlines government's approach for preparing for and responding to and recovering from domestic crisis. We're up to version 3. It was released midway through this year, and it brought into effect a number of important recent legislative changes, which included the establishment of the National Recovery and Resilience Agency, the Australian Climate Service, and enhancements to Emergency Management Australia. For Defence, this revision also reinforced the supporting role that Defence plays in a whole of government response. So let me step through how that works in practice. If for example, a cyclone were to hit Fiji, then it's DFAT as lead agency who would normally convene an interdepartmental committee or emergency task force, which is responsible for assessing the nature and the scale of the crisis, the needs and requests of the country that's been affected by that crisis, and then to consider the sorts of options that we might employ from Australia's perspective to provide support to that government. MSC, as I mentioned earlier, is the defence representative at those forums, and it's all about making sure that we're able to contribute effectively to a national response. As our understanding of the crisis evolves, we work with the policy folks within the department to ensure that the sorts of things that we're considering offering are consistent with our longer term policy objectives. We look down to headquarters JOC and work with the team there to make sure that the sorts of things that we're offering are realistic and sustainable. And then we also work up to CDF and to government to make sure they're comfortable with the general trajectory of the support that we're developing and offering. Once DFAT have settled on a particular solution, then MSC prepare the cabinet or ministerial briefings to get the appropriate approvals for those operations. We then also support CDF's command function by developing the tasking orders for him that mobilise CJOPs and get him supporting or conducting those operations. If it comes to domestic circumstances, then it's a very similar process for us. So, for example, if we were to deal with floods or bushfires or even COVID, then it's the states and territories now that are putting requests forward to the federal government through Emergency Management Australia. And they coordinate, filter, make sure it's an appropriate use of defence resources, and then put those requests to defence. We do go through a process of again, confirming that we're able to support those initiatives. And once they've been agreed, then we go through a formal tasking process and acceptance process with Emergency Management Australia to undertake those tasks. You will all know that in practice, this can be extremely messy. And so as much as, and I think, you know, we've probably all learned something about federalism that we weren't taught on our respective command and staff colleges, because the nature of the coordination that's occurring between state and federal authorities and between different agencies within states at times makes all of this very difficult. And for that reason, you know, we don't rely on process. It really is that's not the right way to describe it, but it's the relationships that we build across government agencies and with Emergency Management Australia that underpins the process and builds the foundation for the process. And if you didn't have those relationships, then we would find ourselves coming aground frequently, trying to provide support. Now, I mentioned earlier that there have been some changes to the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework. Of course, these followed the Bushfire Royal Commission and other inquiries in the wake of the 2019-20 season. And the Royal Commission into Natural Disasters made 3 recommendations that are relevant for defence. The first one that was to essentially build awareness within state and territory governments of the sorts of capabilities that defence could provide, and to improve the interactions between defence and those authorities. It recommended we review our approach to defence assistance to the civil community, which is the formal mechanism we use to support domestic operations where we don't need to use force. And this related specifically to the thresholds which state or territories must reach before they seek Commonwealth support. And finally, the Royal Commission recommended the Australian Government afford legal protections for civil and criminal liability for ADF members when we're conducting activities to support the community. So, for example, if a soldier was involved in demolishing a private property in the wake of a tropical cyclone, then we want to make sure that those individuals, those soldiers, are protected against any sort of potential legal liability that the owners might choose to bring against the Commonwealth. Previously, that protection didn't exist for the ADF. It has existed for some time for emergency service workers, and it just brings the two into alignment. The Defence Legislation Amendment Act 2020 also streamlines the procedures for calling out reserves, and I know this will be of keen interest to you all. It aims to protect civil employment and superannuation conditions for reservists when they are called out to respond to disaster relief and other emergency issues. Now, these amendments to the reserve call-out allow the Governor-General by a call-out order to call on ADF reserves under the Defence Act. And there's a range of scenarios where the Defence Reserve might be used in a call-out situation, war or warlike, which I know is a focus for you in the mobilisation discussions of today's agenda, but also in times of defence emergencies, defence preparation, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, assistance to government authorities and agencies in matters of Australia's national security or interests, which is a catch-all really, and then civil aid, humanitarian assistance, medical or civil emergency, and disaster relief, which is the most common way in which we see Defence Reserves being called out to support the Australian Defence Force. The reserve call-out procedure has been captured internally within Defence by standard operating procedures and a CDF directive. The standard operating procedure standardises and streamlines the actions that would take in the event of a call-out. And I'll step quickly through them. The first is all about preparedness, which is pre-call-out. It's making sure that we've got staff that are suitably trained and equipped and ready to move if they're ever called upon. At the preliminary phase, the next phase there, Defence identifies circumstances that might result in a call-out order, and CDF releases through MSC a warning order to start to get the administrative arrangements into place. Phase 1 then is the actual call-out where the Governor-General authorises a reserve call-out. That's primarily through notification to reserve personnel, their employers, and any other to commence the behind-the-scenes administration. Phase 2 is more precise and specific force preparation, which primarily involves services bringing personnel up to standard to undertake the tasks that they've been identified for. That can include administrative tasks, health tasks, remediation of equipping and training of equipment, and then training personnel if that's required as well. Then mounting phase, you'll be all familiar with that. Execution is obvious. And then finally redeployment and reconstitution, where what we seek to do at that point is not just formally hand over the tasks that have been undertaken by reserve personnel to civil agencies, but also go through a formal demounting process, which is effectively the reverse of the process that we went through when we're bringing our reserve workforce onto the task. We annually go through a process of validating our reserve call-out procedures through an operation which we call Operation Civil Assist. And the intent is to do that prior to the 2021-2022 high-risk weather season. It won't require that we actually mobilise our workforce. It's more of a tabletop exercise that we'll undertake just to make sure that we understand what those procedures are and that we're able to execute them at short notice if that's required. Now, in addition to the Royal Commission, there was a number of internal reviews that was done by Defence after Operation Bushfire Assist. The most important of these include a review of the mechanisms for mobilisation and supporting policy frameworks, which was led by Defence Personnel Group. And I know that my good friend, Major General Natasha Fox, is talking to you later today, and she will be able to cover all of the details of that mobilisation policy change. A review of Defence specialist capabilities that can be offered to civil authorities. The services are running those independently. And again, I know that you'll have service representatives talking to you about those initiatives. A review of planning and force structure addressed in part by the 2024 structure plan, and that incorporates experimentation and analysis of the ADF's capacity to support natural disasters. And hopefully Nick Turner gave you a bit of insight into how that will be conducted. And finally, there's an initiative between Defence and Emergency Management Australia in coordination with state and territory authorities to enhance integration and strengthen our preparation. And again, that's an ongoing process. I talk to my counterpart at EMA probably 3 or 4 times a week. And we will go out through a process of visiting each of the state joint operation support centres prior to the high-risk weather season to brief them on and basically synchronise our planning for the high-risk weather season. All right, and of course there's been another great innovation, and that's been the establishment of Joint Task Force 629, which enhances Defence's coordination with state and territory authorities, and in particular has played a major role or the major role in Operation Covert Assist. JDF 629 is designed to command and control forces assigned from the services to conduct authorised DAC tasks, or those community support tasks in states and territories. It's quite unique in that normally the ADF would take formed units and assign formed units to a JTF. In this case, the JDF is inducting individuals, thousands of ones and twos, and so you don't have that same organisational structure. But our feedback has been that those people that are getting deployed on domestic support operations, have thoroughly enjoyed the experience. I think we are getting to a point where it's starting to have an impact on some of our preparedness and routine tasks, routine training tasks, and there will inevitably be at some point a threshold where people have done enough of these types of activities. But at the moment, their performance in domestic support has been absolutely exemplary. JDF 629 establishes a national C2 node for command and control and a scalable 2-star domestic headquarters. It's sustained 24/7 operations since March in 2020, and at its height had 4,000 people working and distributed right across Australia. It's fundamentally joint, but built on the foundation of Army's 2nd Division. And as you all know, 2nd Division, headquartered in Randwick, commands a network of state-based Army Reserve formations, essentially at the 1-star level in each of the major state and territory capitals. And it's those 1-star officers that are tightly connected in with the state emergency management commissions and incident controllers. They've got long-term, well-established relationships, and what we're finding is that's providing great intelligence for us as we start to prepare tasks. And when we get to the point of executing them, it's cutting through all of those challenges that sometimes exist in building relationships and establishing headquarters and cooperation, and all of those patterns are already there. What it has done is connected us at the planning level and at the command level within each of the state and territory joint operations support centres. In JDF 629, we have operationalised the total workforce to scale up the ADF capacity. CIRCAT 3 and 5 represent over a third of those people that have been deployed to JDF 629. Most have served within headquarters, meaning that they're able to support longer force assignment periods, provide continuity in leadership, and strengthen the permanent workforce contribution to those. It's also created employment opportunities for those reserve officers that might have found themselves unemployed in times of domestic crisis, particularly with COVID. And so we've had people that range from those working in manufacturing and service industries all the way through to commercial airline pilots. They're all been assigned to JTF 629 since March last year. The JDF will continue to spearhead Defence's support to Operation Covert Assist, and it will be tasked to coordinate any defence support throughout the high-risk weather season. With the Joint Task Force established prior to the high-risk weather season, our ability to leverage, and this is really reinforcing the point I made earlier, the ability to leverage liaison networks and the relationships that already exist make us far better prepared and more responsive when we have domestic incidences like bushfire, floods and cyclones. Now that really brings me full circle, because it's an awfully familiar construct to me, one that takes advantage of the inherent complementarities between our permanent reserve workforce, and at the same time it abandons any notion of discrimination between our sailors, soldiers and aviators on the basis of their CIRCAT status when they're actually on the tools. It's precisely my experience of being taught to fly by highly qualified and experienced reserve instructors. So, Paul, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation. As I mentioned at the start, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks for your attention today. I hope my presentation will give you context for what will be a very meaningful conversation throughout the day. I'd be very pleased if there's any questions that you might have to answer those now.